we owe him a great debt in assembling all these other Shakespeare scholars across the water in Spain. But he will now give his talk on, his title is The Link, Cervantes-Shakespeare, Some Spanish Observations. And I think he is supremely well qualified to speak on this subject. He is the Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Murcia. His main current area of research is the reception of Shakespeare in Spain and Europe. He's got numerous publications which include El Manuscrito Shakespeariano de Manuel Herrera Bustamante, 400 Years of Shakespeare in Europe, for which he was the main editor, Shakespeare en España, Textos 1764-1916, Shakespeare in Spain, an annotated bilingual bibliography, and I think his main, I would thought, claim to fame is that he is the foremost acclaimed translator of the Bard into Spanish. He edited the Teatro Completo de Shakespeare, 30 of the translations being his own work. So I think we have here an important expert and someone who is, as I said, supremely well qualified to tell us about the link between Cervantes and Shakespeare. Ángel Luis.
Thank you very much, Edwin. And I would like to thank all the persons and institutions that have made possible this symposium. And I would like to add that I'm very happy to be here, very pleased to be in Oxford after so many years, because I spent 2 months here ages ago. But I've been in touch with Oxford through publications, colleagues and friends, and also through Chief Inspector Morse. Shakespeare and Cervantes have been linked in various ways in Spain, in Britain, and elsewhere. Their personalities, their lives, and their works have been associated and compared. And here we may remember the famous and influential essay, Hamlet and Don Quixote, of 1860 by Ivan Turgenev. And Shakespeare and Cervantes have also been linked in fiction, as for example in Anthony Burgess's story A Meeting in Valladolid, in which Shakespeare comes to this city and has an encounter with Cervantes, where each writer comments on the achievements of the other and on his own. However, and as we know, and as Professor Hammond has reminded us this morning, the only documented link between the two writers is the history of Cardenio, a play of collaboration between Shakespeare and Fletcher, unfortunately a lost play. In Spain, the tendency to associate or compare Shakespeare with an equivalent national writer begins in the 18th century, and Lope de Vega or Calderón are proposed as Spanish counterparts. These proposals continue in the 19th century, but in this century, some critics also point out that the counterpart does not necessarily have to be a playwright, and that he should be Cervantes. Their observations are expressed in terms which, though brief, are specific and manageable. Manageable, I mean, within my half hour. The first of these writers is José Somoza, a poet and novelist who in 1832, in a note following his translations of some fragments of Henry IV, associated Shakespeare with Cervantes for the first time. And he did so on the basis of their comic genius, as expressed particularly in the way they contrast the behavior of men of honor with that of ruffians. Somoza doesn't draw on any of Shakespeare's comedies, but on Henry IV and the world of Falstaff. For him, the Spanish people's lack of familiarity with Shakespeare as a comic genius is understandable, since in Spain he was known above all as a writer of tragedies, which still holds true today. I cannot go here into just how much is contained in Somoza's brief note, but I would like to emphasize one aspect, namely the presence of comedy in the work of Shakespeare and Cervantes, in that it allows for the representation of everyday reality in general, and particularly that of the lower classes, ruffians included, in plebeian environments and ribald situations. In this respect, it may be useful to remember two of the main characteristic features of realism, as pointed out by Erich Auerbach in his Mimesis. For him, these can be traced back to the Odyssey and gradually develop in European literature till they reach their culmination in such novelists as Balzac and later Virginia Woolf, and are evident in Cervantes and Shakespeare. There, first, the presence of events in contemporaneous everyday life as lived by members of the low and middle classes. Second, the settings which address the memory and the evocative powers of the reader or spectator, who may have seen or known people or things similar to those making up these settings. As we know, Don Quixote, the novel, sets out to contrast the ideal world the knight-errant believes he sees with real and vulgar everyday life. In Henry IV, it's the world of the court and politics that is contrasted with that of the tavern. Obviously, such a brief genre as drama doesn't offer as many opportunities as does the novel to linger on many everyday realistic details. But the fact is that Shakespeare does include them, certainly in Henry IV, even if it's only, for example, to make clear that in some scenes Prince Hal is to be found in the plebeian world of the tavern and not at court. But this doesn't happen only in Henry IV. Even today, although not to the point where it revolted the neoclassical critics, it may strike us that in a tragedy like Macbeth, just after King Duncan has been murdered, a drunken porter comes on stage explaining the effects of drink, among them urination and sexual excitement, followed by impotence. Now, is Somoza right? Can his associating of Shakespeare and Cervantes be confirmed as regards the situations, elements, or references implied in his remarks? I think a possible answer can be found in two letters by novelist Emilia Pardo Bazán of 1882 and 1883. In the former, she holds that Calderon was not to be compared with Shakespeare because Shakespeare was head and shoulders above him, and that the one who could rub shoulders with Shakespeare was Cervantes. Having asserted the greatness of both, she goes into specific details and aspects of both their works. She points out that Shakespeare could be as brutal and crude as reality itself, but that if literature should be a mirror to reality in its various aspects, few like Shakespeare knew how to represent it so faithfully. As for Cervantes, Pardo Bazán observes that he didn't lag behind Shakespeare in his realism. And in this respect, she mentions two situations in Don Quixote that you all know, that of Maritornes' nocturnal escapade, first part, chapter 16, and the details of the adventure of the fooling hammers. The Aventura de los Batanes, first part, chapter 20. I quote from J.M. Coyne's English translation. You will remember that in this latter adventure, we are told explicitly how Sancho Panza did, in Cervantes' words, what no one else could do for him. Well, I don't think there's much point in comparing scatological references in the two writers, not because I'm squeamish or because the subject is not very attractive, but rather because I don't think there's anything like this in Shakespeare. Well, I cannot swear to it, but I think there's nothing like this in English literature till chapter 4 in Joyce's Ulysses. So let us look at Maritornes' nocturnal escapade, which happens when Don Quixote is staying at an inn that he takes for a castle. And bear with me with the details. Don Quixote, who is lying in the attic, has also imagined that the attractive innkeeper's daughter is the daughter of the warden, that she has fallen in love with him, and that she is coming to lie with him. However, it's Maritornes, the coarse serving girl, who enters the attic in darkness, in her shift, and with bare feet, in search of the carrier who she had agreed to meet that night. As we know, the uproar caused by this confusion, which involves Sancho and the carrier as well, ends up in a comic and erotic scene, pure slapstick. It's clear that the erotic desire that the daughter arouses in Don Quixote corresponds to his imagined role of a knight-errant sought after by the amorous lady of the castle, who hosts him. And his words to Maritornes in the attic are probably the most direct expression of sexual desire in him that we can find in the novel. But Pardo Bazán doesn't mention other erotic references in the novel. Remember the practical joke which the innkeeper's daughter and Maritornes play on Don Quixote in chapter 43, first part. Don Quixote is armed and mounted on guard outside the inn. The daughter calls him through a hole in the straw loft. He believes that the beautiful lady daughter of the warden is courting him, again, as in chapter 16. And Maritornes asks him to give one of his hands through her lady through the hole, so as to, quote, appease the great desire which has brought her to this window at such risk to her honor, unquote. And we could add here the story of the widow, a kind of bawdy tale which Don Quixote tells Sancho in chapter 25, first part, according to which the widow, gay, rich, and not a bit prudish, rejects very wise and grave suitors and prefers a young fellow who is coarse, low, and ignorant, but a well-built male. Because she says, and I quote, "For all I want of him, he knows as much philosophy as Aristotle and more." This being said, it should also be added that had Pardo Bazán set out to find more examples like these, she wouldn't have found many more in a novel like Don Quixote, which isn't lavish in erotic situations or expressions. Let us now look at the erotic references and situations in Shakespeare's work. In the second of the aforementioned letters, Emilia Pardo Bazán, who had read Shakespeare in English, writes that he reached a point where Zola, for all his naturalism, would never dare to follow. She says that she spent a whole year translating him aloud in almost family gatherings in which she used to feel embarrassed and had to skip passages that could not be read aloud. She mentions dialogue and situations in Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, All's Well That Ends Well, Henry V, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, and The Merry Wives of Windsor, in which there were, and I quote, 1,000 things by Shakespeare before which Zola ends up being dwarfed, unquote. Even so, Pardo Bazán didn't go very far if we bear in mind the extent of Shakespeare's sexual vocabulary and innuendo as collected and explained in such glossaries as Shakespeare's Body and others like it. Now, how did she perceive this presence? In the first of the two letters I'm referring to, she made clear that if Shakespeare were accused of immorality, and I quote, one would have to laugh and not respond to the accusation, unquote. And without mentioning Thomas Bowdler explicitly, Pardo Bazán attacked, quote, the legion of pygmies bent on expurgating, correcting, and adapting Shakespeare to publish him in harmless editions, unquote. Coming back to Cervantes, Pardo Bazán also gave us to understand that it would be ridiculous to accuse him of immorality because of the incidents and situations mentioned before. I don't want to overinterpret what she wrote in these two letters, but considering the context, I believe that if she denied immorality in Shakespeare and Cervantes, it was because she understood that the sexual content in their works was not an end in itself, and that therefore it shouldn't be censored or expurgated. It seems clear that the effect of Maritornes' nocturnal escapade is the comedy involved in the narrated incidents. But some people may not see it this way and think that this comedy is not enough to conceal the eroticism of the adventure. Such a perception may strike us as out of place, but the Portuguese Inquisition ordered the Maritornes incident to be expurgated from this chapter in the Quixote. As for Shakespeare's play, and leaving aside Bowdler's non-institutional expurgations, what Emilia Pardo Bazán didn't know was that a copy of Shakespeare's second folio, owned by the English College in Valladolid, was expurgated by the Inquisition in Spain around 1645. I have said in Spain and not Spanish, not because the book was kept in the library of an English Jesuit college, but because the expurgator was Father William Sankey, an English Jesuit who was the rector of that college for some time. Incidentally, both Bowdler and Sankey coincided on one point. Bowdler didn't know what to do with Measure for Measure, and in the end he decided to include it in his edition, not with Shakespeare's complete text, but with that of a popular stage version which omitted the presence of a pregnant and married Juliet and the scene in which the bed trick is discussed. As for William Sankey, the inquisitorial censor, he must have realized that crossing out so much immoral text as he was reading in this play would be hard work, so he chose to tear out the whole play. I'm now going to move on to a very different aspect in which some 19th century Spanish writers linked Shakespeare and Cervantes. I refer to their power to create realistic, true-to-life and universal characters with great pictorial or iconic potential. The first of these writers is Antonio Alcalá Galiano, the first Spaniard who taught Spanish literature in the newly established Department of Spanish at the University of London in 1828. I believe that Shakespeare knew how to create he believed that Shakespeare knew how to create, and I quote, persons so real and lifelike that we all think we can recognize them, unquote. He added that in this respect, he could only compare him with Cervantes, and finished his observations as follows. And we Spaniards should know what this creation of true-to-life characters consists in when, on remembering the Knight of La Mancha, we keep him so well portrayed in our imagination that looking at his face as drawn by artists, we say whether or not he is like him. It would be reasonable to conclude that Alcalá Galiano could also have illustrated his observations with some Shakespeare character, since according to him, his characters were so portrayed that we all believe we can recognize them. Some 30 years later, novelist Juan Valera also had something to say on this pictorial power in Shakespeare and Cervantes. For Valera, Shakespeare distinguishes himself by his power to produce, quote, lifelike, well-defined characters, complex in their nature and conditions, unquote. And according to him, in Spanish literature, only Don Juan and the characters in Don Quixote can compare to Shakespeare's in this respect. In fact, Valera believed that with the exception of Don Juan, no character of the Spanish Golden Age drama is there so much life as in Shakespeare's. To prove his point, he provided the following example. An artist friend of his had painted characters like Romeo and Juliet easily, but had not been able to represent any from the Spanish drama because nobody would understand the picture or recognize the characters. We may conclude that if for Valera the characters in Don Quixote can be compared with those of Shakespeare's because they breathe so much life, they are also as iconic and representable as those by Shakespeare. Emilia Pardo Bazán also wrote on this aspect. She observed that the denizens of Shakespeare's world are individuals of our species who breathe, walk, and stand, and as far as the female characters are concerned, she said, what a gallery of marvelously portrayed women. Then art comes, or the instinct of the artist, to awaken in us the physical sensation that we can hear and see his models. We all judge Ophelia to be fair-haired, slender, with an oval face, of delicate forms. We all know that Lady Macbeth was tall, sharp-faced, with thin lips and pale cheeks. Isn't that so? Well, I don't think it is. Or not quite so. But before explaining why not, I should point to the observable differences in the approach of these three writers, and particularly to their criteria. That of Alcalá Galiano would be one of fidelity to the text, whereas Valera's would be the interpretative freedom of the artist. As for Emilia Pardo Bazán, one could say that these two criteria coexist in her observations. She seems to suppose that the portraits of Ophelia and Lady Macbeth she imagines are based on physical data or details provided by Shakespeare, but also that the creativity of the artist enables us to feel and see these characters. Nevertheless, as far as Cervantes is concerned, and however little we may have read of Don Quixote, we can see that a detailed physical description of his characters was not one of his methods or his aims, and that it's difficult to locate a full portrait of them, since his descriptive references are scattered throughout the whole novel. Despite this, to us, and apparently to Alcalá Galiano and Valera, these few strokes seem more than enough to suggest characters full of life. And yet, the image of the two main characters that has come down to us does not coincide completely with what Cervantes has told us. Don Quixote is represented as an elderly knight, hawk-nosed and with a sharp-pointed beard. But Cervantes only says that he was strong, thin, and lean-faced, of almost 50 years of age, and not much more. Sancho Panza is usually represented as a tubby villager with a round face, but in chapter 9 of the first part, although he is referred to as having a big belly and a short body, he is called Sancho Zancas, in English Sancho Longshanks, as your king Edward II. However, how many times has he been represented with long legs? The prototypical representation of both characters seems to have been established in 1863 with Gustave Doré, although the image of a tall and thin Don Quixote and a short and fat Sancho was frequent and has reached us in images so disparate as in the characterization of the actors in Kosintsev's Russian film or the schematic strokes of a Daumier or a Picasso. And here I'd like to show you a few pictures. Well, you know this one, Don Quixote and Sancho. Then Don Quixote again, Doré. In the Russian film I mentioned, again, Daumier, Honoré Daumier, and obviously Picasso. Okay. And I'm not sure I can come back to, yes. But let us not forget, however, and in some early representations, those of the 17th century and some of the 18th, we do see a different Don Quixote. Above all, a rather younger Don Quixote than Cervantes portrays, probably to emphasize the general idea of a young knight-errant as against the particular image of Don Quixote. But let us not forget that some modern representations, like one of 1900, in which Don Quixote appears somewhat younger than in Doré's established image. Here are a few of them. François Rago, 1660. Don Quixote presented as a kind of Miles Gloriosus. Then, here from a German edition, Thomas Götzen, 1669. Then two by John van der Baak, 1723. Again, van der Baak. Oh, sorry, I think. No. There's just this one. And then this one by Walter Crane, 1900. You see that here, even here, Don Quixote is much younger than as represented by Doré, years later after Doré. As for Shakespeare, he isn't lavish in detailed physical description either, and doesn't describe Ophelia or Lady Macbeth to us exactly as Emilia Pardo Bazán imagined them. Ophelia, slender and oval-faced. In Hamlet, she is called pretty, fair several times, even beautified. Lady Macbeth, tall, sharp-faced, with thin lips and pale cheeks, is only addressed as fair and noble hostess by King Duncan, in what is rather a compliment than a description. Wasn't our novelist before a kind of literary mirage? If we rule out photographs or prints of actresses, as they cannot always respond to the physique or the face imagined by Pardo Bazán, the engravings representing them show them with very varied figures and faces. If we limit ourselves to Ophelia, we may find among others the following pictures. Well, you know this very well, the Millet 1852. I don't think we can see very much of the face there, but this is in a way the point. And then the death of Ophelia by Delacroix, 1 year later, 1853. Then Ophelia by Jean-Baptiste Bertrand in Un Night's edition of Shakespeare, 1873. Maybe she has an oval face. I don't know what you think. And now we come go back to the 18th century, and we have this picture. This is by Marcus Stone, 1888. And now we come back to the 18th century, and we have this one by John Hamilton Mortimer. My question is, fair Ophelia? Pretty maid? I don't know. Anyway, we could, however, ask ourselves why Pardo Bazán saw them in that way and attempt an explanation. In this respect, we could also ask ourselves why she didn't mention such a character as Falstaff, whom Shakespeare describes through others' references, more specifically through their insults, and whose numerous graphic representations make us think of the criterion of fidelity to the text, which Alcalá Galiano seemed to invoke regarding Don Quixote. To conclude, in this talk I have intended to discuss the link Cervantes-Shakespeare by limiting myself to specific aspects observed by 4 Spanish writers of the 19th century. First, a textual representation of everyday life, which doesn't exclude plebeian ambience or ribald situations. And second, the graphic potential of their characters and the artistic realization of them. I hope that my presentation has stimulated an interest in such themes and leads to more extensive contrasts or contrastive studies that others may undertake. Thank you very much.